that Joseph Smith found out that John C. Bennett was practicing sexual exploits with female members of the LDS Church. And for whatever reason, when Joseph Smith found out about that, he excommunicated John C. Bennett, even though he was a member of the First Presidency and even though he was the mayor of Nauvoo. Joseph Smith had no problem putting his foot down and exercising ecclesiastical excommunication on members who were not towing the line and not doing what it was that he told them to do, or doing what he thought was inappropriate. So my question is this. If we know this about Joseph Smith, which we do because of the example of the excommunication of John C. Bennett, how is it that Brigham Young and Willard Richards and Heber C. Kimball and all this assorted crew of high-ranking officials in the LDS Church, who, according to the polygamy deniers, were practicing polygamy behind Joseph Smith's back, how did they escape being excommunicated? Are we really to believe that they were doing this without Joseph Smith's knowledge? Let's get real for a minute. Joseph Smith was the prophet of the church. People didn't come to Nauvoo because of Brigham Young to follow him. They didn't come to Nauvoo to follow Willard Richards or Heber C. Kimball. They may have been missionaries whose message they accepted, but they came to Nauvoo because they believed that Joseph Smith was the prophet of God. Joseph Smith had eyes and ears everywhere in Nauvoo. And if anybody had gotten wind of members of the Quorum of the 12 or anybody else practicing polygamy, and Joseph Smith wasn't part of it, you can bet Joseph Smith would have heard of it. It is impossible for me to imagine any other scenario in the real world where that would not have happened. And if and when that had happened, and Joseph Smith gets word that Heber C. Kimball and Brigham Young are practicing polygamy, he would have done the exact same thing to them that he did to John C. Bennett. They would have been excommunicated. And so the very fact that they were not excommunicated shows to me that they were not practicing anything that Joseph Smith did not agree with and adopt and probably instituted in the first place. I want to underscore once more that this is a facet of the conspiracy theorist mindset, that any evidence against your position can be controverted simply by pulling some kind of fanciful, made-up explanation unrooted to any kind of historical evidence out of your arse and saying, this is the way it happened. But not only that, not only do fanciful theories rule the day with conspiracy theorists, there is also this element that they don't even think one step beyond their fanciful theory to see how it doesn't make sense and it would not work in the real world. It's almost as if they're just trying to come up with any kind of explanation they can, wave away the problem, and then go on to the next issue as quickly as possible so that people won't have time to think about how unlikely and impossible the explanation they just gave to the prior problem really is. The first thing to note is that without any methodological basis, Ms. Stone goes from disbelieving anything that John C. Bennett writes in his book to believing the Martha Brotherton affidavit, even though it is published in his book. Having made that observation, let's go on to what she does with this affidavit. Now, for those of you who do not know, Martha Brotherton was a young lady who came to Nauvoo, and in her affidavit, she says that she was approached one day about 3 weeks after she arrived by Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and ultimately by Joseph Smith, with whom she had a protracted face-to-face conversation behind closed doors where Joseph Smith is attempting to convince her to marry Brigham Young as one of Brigham Young's plural wives. She signed this affidavit in St. Louis, Missouri on July 13th, 1842. We know she had been in Nauvoo about 3 weeks at that time because that is how she opens her affidavit. I had been at Nauvoo near 3 weeks, during which time my father's family received frequent visits from Elders Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball, two of the Mormon apostles. Now, to start off with, Joseph Smith is the prophet of the restoration. He is the reason people are joining the church. He is the reason people are gathering to Nauvoo, because of Joseph Smith. They're not going there because they think Brigham Young is a prophet. They're not going there because they think Heber C. Kimball is a prophet. They may accept their message as missionaries to them where they are teaching about the Book of Mormon and they're teaching about Joseph Smith being a prophet, but they are not joining the church because of Brigham Young and because of Heber C. Kimball or because of anybody else except for Joseph Smith. So typically, when new converts arrive on the docks at Nauvoo, Joseph Smith goes to personally greet them as they come on shore. And if he were not there to greet them personally, one can imagine that the first order of business, or at least the second order of business, once you get yourself established in Nauvoo, would be to find Joseph Smith and to greet the prophet, to see the man that caused you to make this journey and this sacrifice and this complete disruption and change of your life course. You would want to see Joseph Smith. Now, the reason I bring all this up is because Ms. Stone's explanation for Martha Brotherton's affidavit is not to dispute that she's telling the truth. Her explanation is that Heber C. Kimball and Brigham Young brought in a ringer for Joseph Smith. It wasn't really Joseph Smith that was talking to Martha Brotherton, at least not according to Ms. Stone. It was some other guy that they told her was Joseph Smith. This is a rather long affidavit, and you can find it easily online. But let me read to you a little bit about the discussion and conversation face-to-face that Martha says she had with Joseph Smith. This is picking up in the middle of the affidavit. "Well, Martha," said Joseph, "just go ahead and do as Brigham wants you to. He is the best man in the world, except me." "Oh," said Brigham, because Brigham was present too. "Oh," said Brigham, "then you are as good." "Yes," said Joseph. "Well," said Young, "we believe Joseph to be a prophet. I have known him near 8 years and always found him the same." "Yes," said Joseph, "and I know that this is lawful and right before God. And if there is any sin in it, I will answer for it before God. And I have the keys of the kingdom. And whatever I bind on earth is bound in heaven. And whatever I loose on earth is loosed in heaven. And if you will accept of Brigham, you shall be blessed. God shall bless you, and my blessing shall rest upon you. And if you will be led by him, you will do well. For I know Brigham will take care of you. And if he don't do his duty to you, come to me, and I will make him. And if you do not like it in a month or two, come to me, and I will make you free again. And if he turns you off, I will take you on." And it goes on in this vein with this face-to-face conversation that Martha Brotherton has with Joseph Smith. So here's my first problem with this fanciful story that Ms. Stone makes up to explain how it is that Joseph Smith really was not involved in this, because it was somebody else pretending to be Joseph Smith. Number one, the odds are that Martha Brotherton knew what Joseph Smith looked like before this meeting 3 weeks after she arrives at Nauvoo. Number two, even if she didn't, Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball have to know that she doesn't know what Joseph Smith looks like. Because if she knows what Joseph Smith looks like, and they present somebody who's not Joseph Smith pretending to be Joseph Smith, that plan is going to blow up in a mushroom-shaped cloud on the spot. But let's say that all of this is true. Let's assume for the sake of argument that this fanciful theory, which is unsupported by any kind of evidence, is true, and that really this is not Joseph Smith, this is someone else. So what happens as soon as she leaves the room, whether she accepts it or whether she doesn't, and she does not accept this proposal by Brigham Young? What happens after she leaves the room and walks around and goes to, I don't know, church, and hears Joseph Smith preaching and sees Joseph Smith and says, "Wait a second, that's Joseph Smith. That's not the same guy who was talking to me behind closed doors with Brigham Young." And then what happens? Then she tells Joseph Smith, and the entire escapade of Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball and all their machinations get brought to light, and they get excommunicated, just like John C. Bennett. That's exactly what would happen, and Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball would have enough intelligence, which doesn't take a lot, to figure out what would happen. So I'm saying that this story that Ms. Stone has created is not only unlikely at the outset, it is something destined to failure and would have failed if indeed it had been done the way that Ms. Stone says it was done with a ringer for Joseph Smith. This is the kind of motivated reasoning that we find throughout the polygamy deniers' responses to evidence that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. Come up with any kind of story, no matter how crazy it is, no matter how unworkable it is, no matter how impossible it would be to pull off, say that must be how it happened, and then rush off to something else. I've already talked about that before. This is just another example of that same kind of thing. The obvious solution to this predicament is to posit that Martha Brotherton was actually blind, and that's why she could not tell that this person who is representing himself as Joseph Smith was not Joseph Smith. But maybe I go too far there. I should not be giving the polygamy deniers any ideas.